Let's look at the data that went into Minard's map, load it into Python, and start to work with the data a little bit. I got the data. We're going to load it into a table so that we can work with it in Python. And here's what the table looks like. You can see here's the data that I referred to. It's got a whole bunch of different columns. And by the way, as you look at this, maybe this will give you a new appreciation for his visualization. When you look at the table, there's a lot of text and digits going on there, and maybe it doesn't have quite the same impact as the picture does. Okay, so we got this data. It's in a table. I mentioned I was going to show you with a table how to ask Python to tell us the number of columns in the table, so we can do that with the num_columns operation. That'll tell us 5. If you want to know the number of rows, guess how you do that? With num_rows. You can also ask Python to tell you the labels at the top with the labels operation. This time I'm going to spell it correctly. There are the labels at the top. Maybe more interesting is if you want to extract the data from one column. Let's say we want to get an array containing the number of survivors at each stage. That's found in the survivors column, so we can do that with the method called column. We need to tell it which column we want, and that'll make for us an array with the number of survivors at each stage. You can indicate the column you want by passing an argument that's a string, that's the name of that column. Or if you want, you can do it by counting. You can give the number. So you can do it something like this. Or no, column 4. And there you got the same array. Now at this point, you might be wondering, you might be thinking, that's weird. Survivors, that doesn't look like column 4, that looks like column 5. That's because you're a perfectly reasonable person, but unfortunately Python isn't. Python doesn't count like that. Python counts starting from 0. So it considers the leftmost column to be column 0, and then we've got column 1, column 2, column 3, and survivors is column 4. So that's why we use the number 4 instead of 5, and that'll give us the survivors column. That can be a little confusing, so my suggestion is when you want to pull out a column, pass an argument that's a string with the name of the column, and then you won't get confused by this kind of thing. All right, so you can see from this array how many survivors there are at each stage. How many people were in the army initially when it first began the campaign? Well, if you look, that's the first element in the array. You can see the number there is 145,000. So there were 145,000 people initially in the army. How would we get that with a Python expression? How would we get that programmatically? Well, when you learned about arrays, you know that there are some methods that you can perform on arrays. And one of the operations, one of the methods is called item, that lets you extract a single element of the array. In this case, we want the beginning item. Remember that Python counts starting from 0. So the beginning element, the element at the start of the front of the array, is item number 0. So there we can get the initial number of survivors, the initial size of the array, by that Python expression. Let's give that a name because we're going to use it again. Let's call it initial size. Great. Now we can check what that name got associated with, and sure enough, it got associated with the number 145,000. Great. Now, if we look at this table has numbers, the number of survivors, as a count. Might be thinking maybe this would have more impact if instead we had a percentage there, showing the percent of the initial number of people that still are alive at each stage. So let's figure out how to compute that and augment this table with those percentages. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this array right here, and we're going to divide each one of those elements by the initial size of the army. And that will give us a bunch of percentages. Remember how divide works as an operation on arrays? When you take array divided by a number, it divides every element of that array by the number. We're going to give that a name. Let's call that percentage surviving. That's an array that has a bunch of percentages showing the percent that are surviving at each stage. And now we're going to add that to the table. How do we create a new table with one more column? Use the with column operation. So starting with the Minard table, we add a new column. Let's call it percent surviving. And we need to give it the data to put in that column as an array. And we just constructed such an array. So we pass that as an argument. And that will construct a new table that has an additional column. Let's take a look at it. There we go. There's our table. One more column with the percent surviving. Great. Except, wait a minute. Those don't look like percentages to me. 0.96. Huh. I wanted that to be 96% and it came out as fractions. Well, okay. Well, Python has a way to indicate that you should display and treat that column as a percentage. And there's a magic incantation you could do if you use the following code. Then it'll display the table, and now it'll display that last column as percentages. You don't need to worry too much about that. That's just a piece of magic that'll make it display nicely. All right, so what do we do here? We used some of the array operation and table operations we've been learning about to do a little bit of computation to compute for us the percentage surviving and add that to the table. So that was a pretty simple computation, but it's just an example. And as this class goes on, you're going to learn how to piece together the operations to do more and more sophisticated computations.